The Apple and the Envelope by Herbert Montgomery. Part 1. Her name was Myra White, and she came to our school right after Christmas last year. She was sort of different looking. I mean, if somebody asked you what Myra looked like, you wouldn't know what to say, except maybe that she had black hair, and she always wore a green sweater. The girls in our class are awfully fussy about the clothes people wear, especially Joyce. She's got a secret club, and the girls who belong to it have to dress a certain way. And they have a way of insulting people that they think is so smart. The minute I saw Myra walk into our room, I knew Joyce wouldn't like her. Our teacher, Mrs. Peters, gave Myra the desk way back in the corner. Every day Myra just sat there, and I can't remember her ever saying anything worth remembering. One day, on our way to school, my friend Joey and I were fooling around with his little brother's old creepy crawler. Joey had tied it to a string, and he was swinging it around. He kept yelling, "Roarg!" at me every time he bounced the crawler in my face. It made me kind of mad, so I had to think of a way to make him quit. The crawler looked sort of like an octopus and sort of like a spider. Girls don't much like spiders. That gave me a great idea. "Let's put the crawler in Myra's desk," I said. "What for?" Joey asked. "To scare her into talking," I said. "I bet she would jump right out of her seat." "Or maybe scream," Joey said, and I could tell he was getting to like the idea. Joey untied the string and flipped the crawler to me. "You can do it," he said. "You do it," I said, flipping it back. "What's the matter, you scared?" "I'm not scared," I said, catching the crawler as Joey threw it to me. He stuck his hands in his pockets. I knew if I threw the crawler back to him again, he'd just leave it on the sidewalk. "Okay," I said, "I'll do it." We had to wait until noon when everybody was gone for lunch. Joey and I sneaked back to the room and then put the crawler in Myra's desk. We could hardly wait for everybody to come back to the room, and we could hardly wait for Myra to take a book out of her desk. Man, she sure would scream or something then. When we were all in class after the noon bell, I kept looking over to see what was going to happen. Then I got tired of waiting and started to do some reading. I forgot all about the crawler until I heard Mrs. Peters walking away from her desk. She walked back to where Myra sat. Myra had her head down on her desk. I couldn't hear what Mrs. Peters whispered to her. Whatever it was, Myra just got up and walked out. Mrs. Peters hurried after her, and the last thing she said was, "I don't want to hear one word from this classroom." It was quiet for a little while. Then it just seemed like everybody started talking at once. We all got louder and louder. I took a chance on getting back the crawler. I was lucky enough to make it back to my seat before Mrs. Peters came into the room again. She really gave it to us. On our way home that night, I gave the crawler to Joey, and he said, "Myra must be some kind of nut. I know she looked in her desk, and she didn't say a word." "Maybe she wasn't feeling good," I said. "Do you think she went to see the nurse?" "I don't know," Joey said. After that, I forgot about Myra until the next morning when we were back inside the school playground. Mostly we were just fooling around. Myra was standing by herself over beside the building. She was still wearing her old green sweater. It seemed like she wore that sweater just about every day. And then I got my idea. I told it to Joey, and he thought it was a good idea too. So then we went around and told everybody else in our class. When the bell rang, we all waited for Myra to go in. We wanted to be sure she had time to get to her desk. Then we followed her. Instead of going right to our own places, we all walked way to the back of the room so we could go past Myra. One by one, we said good morning in a super sweet way. "Good morning, Myra," I said, and I pressed my lips tight to hold back a laugh. "Good morning, Myra," Joey whispered. He nodded his head as though he was speaking to a queen. The girls behind us sounded like singers getting in tune. "Good morning, Myra. Good morning, Myra. Good morning, Myra. Good morning, Myra." It went on and on. I guess Mrs. Peters was too surprised to do anything but sit behind her desk with her mouth open. Myra looked pretty surprised too. None of us had ever talked so politely to her before. There were a few snickers as the last kids in the line took their places, but Mrs. Peters stopped all sound with just one look. I sat quietly looking into a book so I didn't have to watch anymore. Later at recess, we were all outside choosing sides for a game. Nobody wanted Myra. Patty and Leo were choosing. Then, when there was just Myra left, Patty and Leo began to argue about who had to take Myra. While they were both still arguing, Myra walked back into the school. We played without her. That was kind of the way things went all the time last year. Whenever we lined up to get a drink at the fountain, Myra was always last. When we had to choose sides, she was always last. She was last in gym. At noon, she sat someplace by herself and ate her lunch from a paper bag. For our Valentine's Day party, we had it all fixed so that nobody would give Myra a Valentine. Joyce and all her friends kept giggling about it, so Mrs. Peters put them in charge of making the Valentine box. She had them work on a table near her desk. They used about a ton of paper to cover a cardboard box with red and white hearts. Every once in a while, you could hear Joyce giggling. You can tell her voice almost a mile away. Then Mrs. Peters would look slowly around the room at everybody until it was quiet again. All the time I kept thinking about our plan, but whenever I sneaked a look at Myra, it didn't seem so funny. She always sat with her head bent over a book and her hands beside her face in a way that made her look real sad. I knew Mrs. Peters wouldn't like what we were going to do. So after supper the night before Valentine's Day, I went down to the drugstore to look for a card to give to Myra. I waited around until nobody knew I was in the store. I waited around until nobody I knew was in the store. Then I bought one of those 50-cent Valentines with the satin on the front and everything. It sure smelled like a Valentine for a girl. When I got home, I had to hide the card. Mom would start asking a lot of questions if she saw me with a Valentine like that. For a long time that night, I sat in my bedroom thinking about Myra. We hadn't ever had anyone quite like her in our class before. It seemed that no matter what we did, she didn't do anything back. I kept thinking and looking at the Valentine and trying to decide if I should really give it to her. If anybody in the class found out, they'd be down on me for sure. It bothered me to see the Valentine just lie there on the table. I couldn't take it back. I couldn't send it to anybody else. So right then, I made up my mind to really do it. I printed Myra's name right on the envelope. I tried to do it in a way so nobody could tell it was from me. Then I was stuck. I thought and thought about what to write on the inside. I sure didn't want to put my name there. At last I decided to write, "From a friend." The next day after the party, Joey was real mad. "Somebody spoiled all the fun," he said. "Yeah," I said, "someone sure did." It was about a month after that when Myra moved away. Mrs. Peters told us that Myra's father was a construction worker. He had to move to a new place where there was more work in the winter, and he took the whole family along. It was kind of spooky around school after Myra left. It was all because of the apple. I had seen Myra come in early and give it to Mrs. Peters that last day she came to school. The next morning, the apple was on the corner of Mrs. Peters' desk. It was one of those extra big, delicious apples, almost as big as a softball. There was an envelope beside the apple. I felt kind of hot all over and worried when I saw what it said on the envelope. To a friend. For about a week, the apple stood there all shiny, just like you could taste the juice in your mouth. Then it began drying out. The shine was gone. The apple got drier and smaller and drier and smaller. Mrs. Peters kept that apple and card on her desk for a long time. Joey and I talked about the apple just about every day. Joey always said, "She sure did get even with us. I wish I knew who gave her that Valentine." "Yeah, so do I," was all I could ever say. But I still kept wondering what the kids are like wherever Myra is now, and I sure would like to know what was inside that envelope. Part 2. My mother and I were in the bedroom unpacking boxes. When I looked out the window and saw kids playing, I felt the way I always feel when I have to start going to another strange school. "Can't I just stay home?" I asked, wishing my mother would say that I never had to go to school again. "Myra, you have to go to school," my mother said. She kept on taking things out of boxes and putting them away. "And why would you want to stay home all day when you can be with children your own age?" "Nobody likes me," I said. "Oh, Myra, that's not true. Lots of people like you." "No, they don't." My mother stopped hanging clothes in the closet and sat on the edge of the bed beside me. "I like you," she said, "and Daddy likes you." Before she could finish, I said, "That's different." "How is it different? Relatives have to like you." Mother put her arms around me, and I sort of leaned against her, biting my lips hard so I wouldn't cry. I was sure she couldn't understand what it felt like to change schools so often. I'd gone to so many schools in so many different towns that I couldn't even remember them all. I don't ever want to get to know anybody, I said. Even if I made friends again, we'd just move away and I'd never see them again. I know how you must feel, my mother said softly, but if we didn't move, your father would be out of work. And I thought you liked your last school. I can remember that nice Valentine you got. No one even signed it, I said angrily. It was just a big joke. Nobody makes jokes like that. Yes, they do, Mother. They do. They do. They make jokes like that about me. Mother went on talking to me, but I wasn't even listening. All I could think about was last year and Lincoln School, where I started right after Christmas. When I first walked into the room, Mrs. Peters smiled at me. I thought then that it might be different this time, but it wasn't. She gave me a desk in the back corner of the room. I bet if they had a desk in the hall, they would have put me there, just on the outside of everything. Right away, the trouble started. I hadn't studied half the things everybody else seemed to know, and when Mrs. Peters asked me questions, I didn't know the answers. It was always like that. After lunch one day, a girl named Joyce came up to talk to me. At first, I thought she wanted to be my friend. Instead, she talked about somebody called Anna Marie. Don't you think that Anna Marie is dumb? She asked. I didn't know what to say, but I wanted Joyce to like me, so I nodded my head even though I didn't know Anna Marie. She never knows the answer to anything, Joyce said, real snotty-like. And her hair looks like rats live in it, and she always wears the same ugly sweater, too. Joyce looked up and down the hallway before whispering in my ear, Nobody in the whole school likes her. Having Joyce come up and talk to me made me feel a little happy, but that only lasted until recess when I heard her talking to some other girls in the hall. I heard Joyce giggle as she said, Can you imagine? Myra didn't even know I was talking about her to herself. They all giggled like it was really funny. After that, I hated to wear my green sweater. It was the nicest sweater I had. My dad had given it to me for my birthday, and until then I'd been very proud of it. No matter what Joyce said, I wasn't going to stop wearing that sweater. Things went on like that all the time I was at Lincoln. Joyce and her friends had a club. They only let people in that they liked. Well, I sure wasn't in the club. One other time, when we were all back in the room after lunch, I opened my desk to take out a book. I didn't look inside. As I reached in, I felt this awful thing with legs all over it. I just about screamed, but I didn't dare. I swallowed hard and peeked into the desk. Somebody had put this dumb, creepy thing on top of my books. I knew then that everybody was going to be mean to me, and I put my head down on my desk. I felt sick. Mrs. Peters came over to my desk and talked in such a way that I knew I was going to cry. I couldn't stand to have the class see me, so when I felt my eyes get wet, I got up and ran out of the room. I almost fell on the steps as I raced away from the school. I took the shortest way home through the park. When I came to a tree, I hid behind it. I leaned my forehead against the rough bark and pounded it with my fists. I hate you, I yelled at the tree. And for a long time, I stayed in the park. Later, at home, I told my mother I had a stomachache. She made me go to bed. Things like this were always happening to me. After a while, I couldn't seem to read a book or do any of the work I was supposed to. It wasn't long before Mrs. Peters stopped calling on me in class. Recess was the time I hated most. I can hit a ball better than most boys, but the boys never want you to play ball when you're as good as they are. So we play all those other dumb games. It's worse in a boy-girl game where you have to choose sides. Everybody stands around and the two leaders choose. They always pick the best first. It's not so bad when they pick the first few people because you're still standing in a big bunch, but when it gets close to the end, you can tell the people nobody wants on their side. I used to imagine that if I ever got to be the leader, I would pick the poorest player first. I wouldn't care if my side lost. I'd make the good players know what it was like to not always be first. But that's only a dream, and dreams don't come true just by wishing. I think Valentine's Day is the worst day of the year. It's icky. I always try to think of some excuse to stay home that day so I don't have to watch everybody opening Valentines. When I was going to the Lincoln School, my mother bought me a whole box of Valentines. I put them all in envelopes, but I only wrote a name on one to give to Mrs. Peters. I had that one on the top of the pile so that Mother wouldn't know the rest weren't for anybody. Then, on my way to school, I dumped all but the one on top in somebody else's garbage can, out behind the building where we lived. When it was time for the party, I sat in my place like a stone, dreading the time the heart-covered box was opened. Of course, everybody just got gobs of silly valentines, and I sat there with only one. I knew it was from Mrs. Peters. She would give one to everybody. And I knew her writing. Joyce passed out the valentines. When she put a second one on my desk, I could hardly believe my eyes. She looked as though she couldn't believe it either, so I knew for sure it wasn't from her or anybody in her club. I opened the valentine from Mrs. Peters and slipped the other one in my notebook. That afternoon I rushed home. I was pounding all over, trying to imagine who the valentine could be from. When I got home, I hurried to my bedroom and closed the door. I opened my notebook slowly, thinking I might have imagined the other valentine, but it was still there. I opened it carefully. It was the prettiest valentine I'd ever seen anybody give to anybody in school. I felt warm all over. On the inside, the card said, "From a friend." I felt like I was going to choke. It looked like a boy's printing, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't really care. Someone liked me. I felt soft all over. I wanted to sing. I wanted to cry. I guess the only time I ever felt like that before was when my dad gave me the green sweater. Everything seemed beautiful. School was lots better after that. Sometimes I smiled at kids when I walked down the hall. I couldn't ever be sure that the person I smiled at might not be my friend, but no one ever acted like a friend. And then about a month after Valentine's Day, we had to move again. I guess Lincoln was the first school that I didn't really want to leave. It seemed that if I could stay through the year, things might be better in the fall, but we had to go. I worried about leaving without letting my secret friend know how happy I was, so one night I wrote a letter. It was pretty silly, I guess. There were lots of things I wanted to say, and I wrote them all down. Then, on my way to school, I stopped in the small store where lots of kids go, where lots of the kids who go to Lincoln stop to buy candy and gum. I bought a big apple, the nicest one there was, the delicious kind I like so much. I got to school early and gave the apple and the letter to Mrs. Peters. She asked me lots of questions and told me how nice she thought I was. That was hard to believe. It was sure nice to leave school at noon that day and not have to eat my lunch alone. So that was the end of going to Lincoln School, and now we've moved and I've got to start all over again. "Myra," it was my mother calling gently, "you've been daydreaming." I sat up beside her and looked at the boxes of stuff that still had to be unpacked. "I was just thinking about my old school," I said. "Things will be different in this one," my mother said. I didn't want to argue with her, but how could she know? "Maybe," I said, reaching down to unfold the flaps of another box. "Maybe things will be different in this school, but I doubt it." As I walked to the closet to hang up my green sweater, I looked out the window at the kids playing on the sidewalk. They looked like the kids at Lincoln. I hoped my friend didn't laugh when he read my letter.